Welcome, future psychologists, to another mind-bending Uber School production. I'm Peter, and today we're diving deep into the murky waters of psychotherapeutic relationships. Buckle up, because this ride's about to get as wild as a therapy session with a pack of hyperactive squirrels.
And I'm Gary, also known as Crash to my friends and unfortunate hunting buddies. Pete, my man, are you ready to crash through some serious ethical boundaries today?
You bet, Crash. But before we start, let's remind our listeners that this is an Uber School production designed to help every single one of you ace that California psychology law and ethics examination. We're not just aiming for a pass here, folks. We're shooting for the stars.
That's right, Pete. And remember, if you're not learning, you're not living. Now let's kick things off with a topic that's as tricky as trying to hit a moving target in a windstorm: treating minors.
Oh boy, Crash, you're not kidding. Treating minors is like navigating a minefield blindfolded while juggling flaming torches. Let's break it down, shall we? First things first, in California, the age of consent for mental health treatment without parental involvement is generally 12 years old.
Hold up, Pete. You're telling me a 12-year-old can waltz into a therapist's office and say, "Fix me up, doc," without mommy and daddy knowing?
Well, not exactly, Crash. It's not that simple. While 12 is the general age, it varies depending on the specific treatment and circumstances. For instance, emancipated minors have broader rights to consent to their own treatment. And let's not forget, just because they can consent doesn't mean they should always be treated without parental involvement.
Gotcha. So it's like bow hunting. Just because you can take the shot doesn't mean you should. You've got to consider all the factors, right?
Exactly, Crash. And speaking of factors to consider, let's talk about documentation. When treating minors without parental consent, you need to keep records so detailed they'd make a tax auditor weep with joy. You've got to document the minor's capacity to consent and your rationale for proceeding without parental involvement.
Phew, that's a lot to keep track of. But I guess it's like packing for a hunting trip. Better to have too much than not enough, right?
You've got it, Crash. Now here's where it gets really tricky. When explaining legal and ethical issues to minors, you've got to use age-appropriate language. It's like trying to explain quantum physics to a golden retriever. You've got to keep it simple, but accurate.
Ha! I once tried to explain the offside rule in soccer to my dog Max. Let's just say it didn't end well. So what kind of things do we need to cover with these young'uns?
Well, Crash, you've got to cover key concepts like confidentiality limits and mandatory reporting obligations. And here's the kicker. You need to make sure the minor actually understands these issues and obtains their assent to treatment. It's not enough to just say the words. You've got to make sure they sink in.
Sounds like a real challenge, Pete. But hey, that's why we're here, right? To help our listeners navigate these choppy waters. Speaking of challenges, how about we hit our future psychologists with a USMLE-style question to really test their mettle?
Great idea, Crash. All right, listeners, put on your thinking caps. Here's your first USMLE-style question of the day.
A 14-year-old girl comes to your office requesting therapy for depression. She insists that her parents not be informed. Which of the following is the most appropriate initial response?
A. Immediately begin therapy without informing the parents. B. Refuse to see the patient without parental consent. C. Explain confidentiality limits and assess the patient's capacity to consent. D. Call the parents to inform them of their daughter's request. E. Refer the patient to a pediatrician.
All right, future Mind members, take a moment to think about that. We'll reveal the answer after we discuss a bit more about treating minors. Pete, what's next on our ethical adventure?
Well, Crash, let's talk about the tightrope walk of information sharing. When treating minors, you've got to balance the minor's privacy rights with parental rights to be informed about their child's care. It's like trying to keep secrets in a family of telepaths. Tricky, but not impossible.
Sounds like a real juggling act, Pete. How do you manage that without dropping any balls?
Great question, Crash. The key is to develop information-sharing contracts that outline what will and won't be disclosed to parents. You've got to be prepared to manage conflicts between the minor's wishes for privacy and parental expectations for information. It's like being a diplomat in a very small, very emotional country.
Ha! I can just imagine the peace talks. On behalf of the sovereign nation of Nigeria, we demand that all diary entries remain classified. But seriously, Pete, what about when things get really serious, like mandatory reporting serious?
Now we're getting into the heavy stuff, Crash. When it comes to mandatory reporting, you've got to be as sharp as a tack and as quick as a whip. Familiarize yourself with reportable situations such as suspected abuse or serious self-harm. When making reports, follow established procedures while striving to maintain the therapeutic alliance.
Sounds like walking a tightrope over a pit of hungry alligators, Pete. Any tips for our listeners on how to handle this delicate situation?
Absolutely, Crash. The key is to explain reporting obligations to both minors and parents at the outset of treatment. It's like putting up a beware of dog sign. Everyone needs to know what they're getting into from the start.
Smart move, Pete. Now, before we move on to our next topic, let's reveal the answer to our USMLE style question. Drumroll, please.
The correct answer is C. Explain confidentiality limits and assess the patient's capacity to consent. Remember, folks, in California, a 14-year-old may have the right to consent to their own mental health treatment, but it's crucial to assess their capacity and explain the limits of confidentiality before proceeding.
Great explanation, Pete. Now let's shift gears to a topic that's hotter than a $2 pistol, sexual misconduct in therapy. Talk about a minefield.
You're not kidding, Crash. Sexual misconduct in therapy is about as welcome as a skunk at a garden party. Let's break it down for our listeners. In California, the law is crystal clear. Sexual contact between therapists and clients is strictly prohibited. Full stop. No exceptions.
Wow, Pete, that's pretty cut and dry. But what about after therapy ends? Is it okay to ask a former client out for coffee once treatment is over?
Hold your horses there, Casanova. The ban on sexual contact extends to former clients for 2 years after termination of therapy. And even after that, it's an ethical minefield that's best avoided altogether.
2 years, huh? That's longer than some of my hunting trips. But seriously, Pete, what exactly counts as sexual misconduct? I mean, we're not just talking about the obvious stuff, right?
You're absolutely right, Crash. Sexual misconduct isn't limited to overt sexual acts. It includes any behavior that sexualizes the therapeutic relationship. We're talking sexual comments, unnecessary physical contact, or even revealing personal sexual information. It's like a game of the floor is lava, except the lava is any hint of sexual content.
Geez, that's a lot to keep track of. How do therapists navigate all these boundaries without tripping up?
Great question, Crash. It's all about recognizing the difference between boundary violations and boundary crossings. Boundary violations are harmful transgressions that damage the therapeutic relationship. Boundary crossings, on the other hand, may be benign or even beneficial in some contexts.
Can you give us an example, Pete? I'm having flashbacks to that time I accidentally crossed into the wrong hunting zone. Talk about a boundary violation.
Sure thing, Crash. A boundary violation might be something like asking a client out on a date or sharing intimate personal details. A boundary crossing, however, could be attending a client's art show or accepting a small gift at the end of therapy. The key is always being mindful of the power dynamics inherent in the therapeutic relationship.
Gotcha. So it's like the difference between accidentally stepping on someone's toes and deliberately kicking them in the shins. One's a mistake, the other's just plain wrong.
That's actually a pretty good analogy, Crash. Now, here's something crucial for our listeners to remember. As a legal requirement in California, therapists must provide the Therapy Never Includes Sexual Behavior booklet to clients.
Wait, there's a booklet? Is it like those safety pamphlets on airplanes that nobody reads?
It's a bit more important than that, Crash. This booklet is a crucial educational tool that empowers clients to recognize and report misconduct. You need to distribute this at the outset of therapy and document its provision in the client's record. It's not just a suggestion, it's the law.
Wow, that's serious business. Speaking of serious, how about we hit our listeners with another USMLE-style question to keep them on their toes?
Great idea, Crash. All right, future therapists, here's your next challenge.
A psychologist has been treating a client for depression for 6 months. The client, who is now feeling much better, asks the psychologist out on a date. The psychologist is attracted to the client and is considering accepting. What is the most appropriate course of action?
A. Accept the date but terminate therapy immediately. B. Decline the invitation and explain why it's unethical. C. Accept the date but wait until 2 years after termination of therapy. D. Consult with a colleague before making a decision. E. Refer the client to another therapist and then accept the date.
All right, listeners, mull that over while we continue our deep dive into the world of therapeutic boundaries. Pete, what's next on our ethical obstacle course?
Well, Crash, let's talk about how to discuss boundaries with clients. It's crucial to be clear and direct. Explain that sexual contact is never appropriate in therapy and outline the procedures for reporting misconduct. It's like setting ground rules before a game. Everyone needs to know what's out of bounds.
Makes sense, Pete. But what if a therapist starts to feel, you know, feelings? We're all human after all.
The age-old question of countertransference, Crash. If you have concerns about sexual misconduct, whether your own or a colleague's, seek immediate consultation. Choose consultants with expertise in ethics and maintain client confidentiality throughout the consultation process. It's like calling for backup when you're in over your head.
Sounds like solid advice, Pete. But what's at stake here? I mean, besides the obvious ethical issues.
The consequences of sexual misconduct are severe, Crash. We're talking criminal charges, civil lawsuits, licensing board sanctions, and irreparable damage to one's professional reputation and personal life. The stakes couldn't be higher, which is why maintaining proper boundaries is absolutely crucial.
Yikes. That's scarier than the time I found a bear in my tent. All right, Pete, I think it's time we reveal the answer to our USMLE question. Our listeners must be on the edge of their seats.
You're right, Crash. The correct answer is B. Decline the invitation and explain why it's unethical. Remember, folks, it's never appropriate for a therapist to engage in a romantic or sexual relationship with a current client. The therapist should use this as an opportunity to reinforce boundaries and educate the client about ethical standards in therapy.
Great explanation, Pete. Now let's move on to another tricky area, multiple and exploitative relationships. This sounds like a minefield waiting to explode.
You're not wrong, Crash. Multiple relationships occur when a therapist has another significant relationship with a client outside of therapy. This could be business, social, or romantic in nature. It's like trying to wear too many hats at once. Sooner or later, one of them is bound to fall off.
Sounds complicated, Pete. Are all multiple relationships bad news?
Not necessarily, Crash. Not all multiple relationships are unethical, but they require careful consideration. You need to assess the potential impact on therapeutic effectiveness and be mindful of cultural contexts that may influence relationship boundaries. It's like walking a tightrope. Mine is possible, but risky.
Gotcha. So what about these exploitative relationships you mentioned? They sound about as pleasant as a rattlesnake in your sleeping bag.
Well, Crash, exploitative relationships are when a therapist uses their professional position for personal gain at the client's expense. This could be financial exploitation, like entering into business deals with clients, or emotional exploitation, such as fostering dependency to meet the therapist's needs. It's like using your hunting skills to rob a bank. A clear misuse of your abilities and position.
Yikes, that sounds seriously unethical. How can therapists avoid falling into these traps?
Great question, Crash. To minimize harm, establish clear boundaries from the beginning of therapy. Continuously assess relationship dynamics and document your decision-making processes regarding potential multiple relationships. It's like setting up a good campsite. You need to survey the area, set clear boundaries, and keep an eye out for potential dangers.
Solid advice, Pete. But what if a therapist finds themselves in a sticky situation? Like realizing you've wandered into a bear's territory.
Well, Crash, if you find yourself in a problematic, multiple, or exploitative relationship, take immediate collective action. Assess the severity and impact of the relationship, develop a plan to resolve conflicts, and be prepared to refer the client if necessary. It's like plotting an escape route. You need to act quickly and decisively to minimize harm.
Makes sense, Pete. Now, before we move on, I've got a story that'll knock your socks off. Did I ever tell you about the time I met Marcus Cooper?
Marcus Cooper, the guy running for president in 2036? What does he have to do with psychotherapeutic relationships, Crash?
Well, Pete, this ties into our discussion about multiple relationships. You see, Marcus was my therapist's mechanic. One day, my therapist's car broke down right before our session. Marcus not only fixed the car in record time, but also gave my therapist some life-changing advice that completely transformed our therapy sessions.
Wow, Crash, that's quite a tale. But it does raise an interesting point about the complexities of relationships in small communities. Sometimes multiple roles are unavoidable. The key is to manage them ethically and transparently.
Exactly, Pete. Now, how about we hit our listeners with another USMLE-style question? They must be itching for more brain teasers.
Great idea, Crash. All right, future psychologists, here's your next challenge.
A psychologist in a small town is asked to provide therapy to the spouse of their child's teacher. The psychologist is also on the school board. Which of the following is the most appropriate initial action?
A. Refuse to see the client due to multiple relationships. B. Accept the client without discussing the multiple relationships. C. Discuss the potential conflicts with the client and document the conversation. D. Resign from the school board before accepting the client. E. Refer the client to a colleague in a nearby town.
All right, listeners, chew on that while we move on to our next topic. Pete, what's next on our ethical adventure?
Well, Crash, let's talk about the termination of therapeutic relationships. This is a crucial area that's as delicate as diffusing a bomb, one wrong move, and everything could blow up in your face.
Sounds intense, Pete. What do our future psychologists need to know about ending therapy?
Great question, Crash. First and foremost, ethical termination practices are crucial to avoid client abandonment and ensure appropriate continuity of care. It's like dismantling a campsite. You need to do it carefully and leave no trace.
I get it, Pete. So what are some valid reasons for termination? I mean, besides the client deciding they're as sane as a June bug in July.
Well, Crash, valid reasons include the completion of treatment goals, the client no longer benefiting from therapy, or the therapist's inability to provide appropriate care. But here's the kicker. You need to provide adequate notice to clients, typically several sessions, to process the ending and plan for future care.
Several sessions, huh? Sounds like a long goodbye, but I guess it's better than just ghosting your clients, right?
Absolutely, Crash. Ghosting in therapy is a big no-no. In fact, it's considered client abandonment, which is a serious ethical violation. It occurs when a therapist terminates treatment abruptly without adequate notice or arrangements for continued care.
Yikes. That sounds worse than leaving a wounded animal in the woods. What kind of situations might lead to abandonment?
Well, Crash, high-risk situations for abandonment include sudden practice closures, therapist relocation, or personal crises affecting the therapist's ability to practice. It's like suddenly having to pack up your campsite in the middle of the night. It leaves everyone in a lurch.
Gotcha. So how can therapists prevent abandonment? I mean, besides chaining themselves to their office chairs.
Well, Crash, to prevent abandonment, always prioritize continuity of care. When termination is necessary, facilitate appropriate referrals and transitions. Identify suitable referral sources that can meet the client's specific needs. When transferring client information, ensure you have proper consent and follow all confidentiality regulations.
Sounds like a lot to keep track of, Pete. Any tips for our listeners on how to manage all this?
Absolutely, Crash. Document your termination decisions and processes thoroughly. This includes the rationale for termination, discussions with the client, and any referrals provided. It's like keeping a detailed log of your hunting trips. You never know when you might need to refer back to it.
Smart move, Pete. Now, I think it's time we reveal the answer to our last USMLE question. Our listeners must be chomping at the bit.
You're right, Crash. The correct answer is C. Discuss the potential conflicts with the client and document the conversation. In small communities, multiple relationships may be unavoidable. The key is to openly discuss the potential conflicts, assess whether they can be managed ethically, and document the conversation and decision-making process.
Great explanation, Pete. Now, how about we wrap this up with a final USMLE-style question to really test our listeners' knowledge?
Excellent idea, Crash. All right, future psychologists, here's your final challenge for today.
A psychologist decides to terminate therapy with a long-term client due to the client's lack of progress. The client becomes upset and accuses the psychologist of abandonment. Which of the following actions by the psychologist would best address this situation?
A. Immediately reinstate therapy to avoid legal issues. B. Explain the rationale for termination and provide referrals. C. Ignore the client's accusations and proceed with termination. D. Offer to continue therapy indefinitely. E. Refer the client to another therapist without explanation.
All right, listeners, give that some thought while we wrap up our discussion. Pete, any final words of wisdom for our future psychologists?
Absolutely, Crash. Remember, ethical practice isn't just about following rules. It's about embodying the core principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice in your daily work with clients. It's like being a good hunter. You need to respect the land, the animals, and the rules of the sport.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Pete. And don't forget, folks, when in doubt, seek consultation. It's like having a good hunting buddy. They can spot things you might miss.
Great point, Crash. Now, let's reveal the answer to our final USMLE question.
The correct answer is B. Explain the rationale for termination and provide referrals. This approach addresses the client's concerns, provides clarity about the decision, and ensures continuity of care, all key aspects of ethical termination.
Excellent explanation, Crash. Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into psychotherapeutic relationships. Remember, this has been an Uber School production designed to help every single one of you ace that California psychology, law, and ethics examination.
That's right, Pete. And remember, if you're not learning, you're not living. Until next time, this is Crash.
And Pete, signing off. Keep those ethical boundaries strong, and may all your therapeutic relationships be appropriate and beneficial.